to the conference committee for having me. And I'll go ahead and get started. I would also like to, just in case it helps anyone, share my slides, or rather my script here in the chat in case folks would like to follow along. In English, you do have that option. I'll just go ahead and put that there. But thanks as well to the work of the interpreters and the translators. So I do want to recognize that coming to you from the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, these First Nations speak the Hunkaminam and Squamish languages respectively. And these languages are especially important to recognize in this context because the suppression and erasure of Indigenous languages through colonization is one way of seeing how official or de facto language policy can uphold oppressive power structures, and it shows the importance of being mindful of how policy affects the communities that we serve and connects to other aspects of society and our organizations. Also, as part of situating myself among the issues we're discussing in my expertise, I want to mention that I'm a white settler who grew up on S'Klallam lands in what is also known as the United States, where the linguistic and political situations are somewhat different. As a result, I've learned English and Spanish mainly, not English and or French. And as a recent permanent resident, I'm still learning about Canadian approaches to official language situations and other language issues. In my research as well, I am interested in inclusion and support for people who speak all languages, not just official ones, and my background is primarily in libraries. That being said, I hope this talk will be narrow enough to address this conference's focus on official language minority communities, and broad enough to be relevant for people in all types of organizations. My goal with this talk is to encourage reflection and ideas, and so my talk is pretty high level, but I'm sure that my perspective will be complemented by the other talks at this conference that address more specific measures and programs. I also want to point out that my thoughts on these topics are always partial and a work in progress, and I look forward to hearing from you more in the questions and coffee meetings. So the title of this panel today asks, what policies are required to support access and remove language barriers? And I think it's great that we all agree that removing language barriers is a key part of access. But as the title of my talk suggests, policy is not enough to do this on its own. Ideally, it will support an environment where barriers can be removed, but my view is that you cannot simply manage your way into more inclusive language environments through policy prescriptions alone. They need to be part of more broader and holistic efforts to serve language communities. And so in this time, I'm going to talk about what policy can do, what it can't do, and what else needs to be done in my view. So in terms of what policy can do, overall, I would say it's a tool that signals the commitments of the organization. It's not the only way of signaling commitments. For instance, if a library advertises its services in English and French, I can assume it's committed to these two languages, even if it does not have a set policy in place. However, policy still has a place in that it suggests a long-term commitment on the part of the organization, not just something that is going to be a fad or based on staff capacity or transient funding. And related to this idea of signaling commitments is the idea of visibility. If something is not visible in policy documents, then people may have cause to assume that it is not a value or priority for the organization. Can you imagine, for instance, a library collections policy that does not refer to either intellectual or academic freedom? Maybe they exist. I haven't read every policy out there, but that level of inclusion certainly signals them as a key priority for the field, and it seems hard to imagine a policy without them. By comparison, do we prioritize language to the same extent? Diversity and anti-racism are increasingly visible in a lot of library statements, but do we include language as part of that diversity? If something is in your policy, of course, that doesn't mean that you or your organization don't care about it, but it could mean that others inside or outside your organization don't know or can't tell if you care about it. And so what effect does that have on services, on the rest of the library? If a specific language is not there, be that English or French, it risks being made invisible, and the people who speak that language may not see themselves as supported by your organization. And the role of language in everyday life may seem obvious to some people, but to others it may not. For me in my background, I've certainly seen how primarily monolingual environments, like much of the US, like much of Canada, can very easily produce a situation where the main language is a default to such an extent that people have the privilege of not really having to consider other languages unless they want to in collections, scholarly communications, and elsewhere. The same cannot be said for minority language communities who have to navigate the fact of linguistic difference, maybe on a daily basis. And so making language visible shows an awareness of the challenges and opportunities afforded by linguistic difference and shows that your organization is committed to these communities as well. Another idea I want to consider is how policies are one chance to show relationality and reciprocity, and this is perhaps a bit less common of an idea. I want to thank Jesse Lawyer and other Indigenous scholars for sharing their knowledge and thinking on this topic, which is very important work. Jesse Lawyer defines relationality as defined roles in how we are related to each other, and reciprocity as who we are accountable to and responsible for. And I think simply acknowledging these factors, that we are all embedded in relationships and accountable to each other, and having that kind of meta awareness is huge. Policies are by no means the only way of showing relationality and reciprocity, and I think it's to an extent a Western idea to say that we can define or dictate relationships through policy, but it's how things are currently done to an extent, and so within our very Western context sometimes, policies can define how parts of the organization relate to other parts of the organization or to people, whether internally or externally. And so to extend the metaphor a bit and going back to the idea of showing commitment, few people probably want to be in a relationship with someone who isn't committed to them, right? So it's important to have kind of a defining the relationship talk for language and other issues, whether that comes through and happens in policy or elsewhere, and to determine how your organization is going to commit to these communities, to these languages. If you do not address language in your policy, then you are in a sense saying there is no relationship between our language or our organization and other languages and the people who speak them. All business must be conducted on our terms in the dominant language, and we're not going to acknowledge that other languages exist. By contrast, addressing language in your policy or elsewhere says, we see you, we recognize that your languages are part of our community, and we want to be there for you. So some questions here for everyone are, how do our organizations relate to the language communities they serve? Do we make these relationships explicit and commit to them in policy or other areas? Are they reciprocal? And finally, policies can also be used to show accountability, which I think is important if we continue with this idea of values, relationships, reciprocity. Accountability is, again, maybe a less common use for them, but I think we should consider whether and how to make that accountability explicit and why or why not we wouldn't. As an analogy, many collections policies will say, we have a procedure for considering challenges to materials in the collection. Even if they don't say what the procedure is, they are making the processes of challenging and community feedback visible, presenting them as options, and committing themselves to accountability in this regard. And so in a similar vein, if we fail to provide good service to communities who use a minority or non-dominant language, how are we accountable when we mess up? So policy can help indicate commitment, relationships, and accountability. And as far as they are concerned, my main suggestion is to bake language into your policies, to evaluate them for whether and how they address language. Does your policy count language as a form of diversity? Is it informed by research and other forms of evidence? For example, the literature on language acquisition generally agrees that people learn other languages best when they have access to supports and resources in a language they already know. So even if we have an official language of instruction or collecting that we must adhere to, where and how can we provide that scaffolding? And I want to recognize that doing this work of evaluating policies can be difficult. We often have multiple competing demands, scarce resources, and even beyond that, following through can be even harder. You may have to do work behind the scenes to build your capacity to a point where you can actually commit to supporting multilingualism, bilingualism in a policy. Which brings us to the other side of things, what policy can't do. So as I've argued, if language about languages is not encoded in policy, then there is less cause to be active and accountable on these linguistic issues. However, even if you craft good policy documents, they do not guarantee action. Look at all the statements on racism put out last year by organizations in response to the police killing of George Floyd. How many of those had lasting consequences, and how many of those were largely performative? As these statements show, words can't guarantee lasting change or reform on their own. There has to be will behind the words, in some cases funding, material support. And the fact is that people often have vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Organizations may choose to maintain the status quo because it's easier. But the question is, who does that benefit? If we don't commit time and resources and effort to this problem, we will simply end up reproducing society in its current form. And there's a lot of inertia at play, especially in areas where one language is dominant. And so policy remains insufficient for addressing the daily reality of being a minority language user in many settings. In addition to the question of effort, there's also the question of interpretation. Supporting minority language communities can mean very different things to the manager of a library versus members of the communities themselves. So how a policy is interpreted is almost as important as whether there's a policy in the first place. And this comes back to that idea of accountability again. What do you do when people disagree on how that policy should be applied? Are you equipped to be accountable and to hear the voices of everyone affected, regardless of language? Another thing policy can't do is govern and define specific procedures. These are often things that will have to be worked out internally depending on context, but it's still worth asking at a high level. What workflows do we have in place for acquisitions, cataloging, hiring, teaching, etc.? And does language enter into these at any point? How are we actually going to carry out these abstract values that we talk about in policy? To start wrapping up, I want to briefly review a few possible areas for change outside of policy as part of broader efforts, what to do about the things that policy can't do. If you're trying to change things with policy, you need people to create and support the change, and you need to have material infrastructure in place to support those people. As such, staffing is a huge issue with regards to language because people are really at the heart of libraries. They bring their language skills to work. They interact with people who speak other languages, and their attitudes towards language determine the kind of work that gets done. So just a few example ideas here include, do you have an inventory of what languages your staff are comfortable using on the job? Do you encourage staff to advertise what languages they speak in some way, perhaps in a staff directory with pins and badges? Do you pay multilingual workers a premium for their use of another language on the job? Even if staff don't speak another language, do you still train them in communication strategies across language barriers? And do you try to police staff language use in any way? Collections are also important because they make up a huge part of the rationale for our organization's existence. Do your collections reflect the languages present in your community? And I see there's another study kind of looking at this with regards to French language populations and French language collections, very interested in that. Are you equipped to treat works in other languages the same in selection, cataloging, deselection, and other processes? Are the collections and their spaces available and navigable in multiple languages? And then with other areas, instruction, programming, and so on, do you make space for learners to use their own languages? Do you address multilingual, bilingual search and discovery or language barriers in scholarly communications? And these are by no means exhaustive. So we're all here, I assume, because we think libraries and archives can do a better job in their treatment of languages and the libraries who speak them. My view is that to improve access in general, we need to take a holistic approach to language and recognize how it is connected to power, culture, race, class, gender, nationality, and to more. There's a very neoliberal tendency in much of society to commodify language, to treat it as a problem to be solved or managed. But this is reductive and strips it of so much of its meaning. Language is woven into our social fabric. It's the means by which we have social relationships, and it affects people's material reality and experience of the world. As I hope I've shown, policy is not enough on its own to address the extent to which language permeates libraries, archives, and other organizations. It has some value, but I think we also have to change hearts and minds, and in some cases, people's beliefs about language itself. Doing so can be tough. Again, we're at the mercy of pre-existing systems with a lot of inertia, but I think conferences like these are a great first step. And so I'd like to use just the last couple minutes of my time to close with some general questions and create some space for reflection. And as well, you can take a couple of minutes of these questions. Also feel free to just close your eyes, get some water, check in with your body. I know Zoom fatigue is very real. Otherwise, I'll leave you with these further questions and until the rest of my time runs up, and I invite Robert to chime in and move things along once we're ready to go. So thank you all for your time and enjoy the rest of the conference.